So the current status quo is that a clinical scientist or physiologist who is a highly skilled professional will acquire the images in a patient when they come for a cardiac ultrasound or echocardiogram. The slot that's booked will be 45 minutes and the acquisition of the images will take about 20 minutes, and the person taking the scan will make the measurements on the ultrasound machine. And then the report will generally be checked by a cardiologist. All of this is fairly labour intensive, and certainly in the UK we've got very long waiting lists and we've got capacity issues with patients needing these scans. We obviously can't really increase the number of staff who are highly skilled to do these scans, so we need to try and improve the efficiency.
Hey everybody, this week I'm joined by Charlotte Manisty, and she's a professor of cardiology at UCL, specialising in cardiac MRI, clinical lead for Cardio-Oncology at Barts, and is on the board of the International Society for Cardiovascular MR, and leads the UK Joint Working Group on MRI for patients with cardiac devices like pacemakers and defibrillators. Also secretary of the British Cardio-Oncology Society, and is one of the directors and the founder of Healthtech company MyCardium AI, UCL spinout, and that is leading the revolution in cardiovascular scanning, harnessing the power of AI, developed by clinicians, transforming accuracy, precision, and consistency of imaging, which is paving the way for new and innovative treatments that will greatly improve patient outcomes. What an introduction that is, Charlotte. You're quite busy from the sounds of things, so how are you?
I'm fine. I'm constantly kind of jumping between things, but I'm fine, and I'm at an exciting time in my career where I've been able to kind of incorporate everything from academia and clinical to hopefully use that through MyCardium to benefit patients. It's the general aim.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's really nice actually that you say exciting. That's the first thing that you say, because it is exciting. And I think actually you've probably reached the sort of level that I think so many of us that started as doctors, like in part maybe assumed we'd get to, or wanted to get to, or aspired to get to, and to be able to kind of lean into all of your interests, I guess, and actually pick these roles that give you something, as well as you obviously giving something to the role. Like you're having you know, academia and teaching and tech and innovation and like all these sort of needs met, I guess, by like everything in your career. So it's obviously an awesome place to get to. But before I sort of get into that and ask you about your story, whereabouts, in fact, it's pertinent to ask you, given what you've just told me, but whereabouts are you based? Where are you talking to us from today?
I'm talking to you from UCL, but from one of our clinical research facilities. And we're scanning an MRI pacemaker list, which is why I had to nip out a second ago just to do a pacemaker reprogramming. It really kind of highlights that, in fact, I'm constantly jumping between things, but it's great, and that's what keeps me interested. Yeah,
awesome. Let me ask you then, Charlotte. Plot us the path through your career, because, as I say, it doesn't just happen, that sort of stuff. Clearly an interest in cardiology from what was probably early in your career, but how does one get to being all of those things on the medical side and a founder of a tech company and being able to balance all of that stuff? So I guess chronologically, why don't you tell us your story?
I mean, my story was much more conventional than it may sound. I was a medical student at Oxford and then came to Imperial for my clinical. I then did my normal clinical training, did a PhD with really someone who was totally inspirational called Darryl Francis, who many of you may know. He is a maverick. He's a extremely intelligent, world-leading person who really questions dogma, questions what many have taken for granted before as being the fact. And I think through him, he really made me think about doing things a different way. My PhD was actually in cardiorespiratory physiology and heart failure, but we were creating devices. He had me soldering Heath Robinson instruments to try and develop different ways to treat a condition called periodic breathing, which actually thankfully is largely less common now because of all the good medical treatments for heart failure. But he really taught me to rethink things differently. And it was through him that I really generated an interest in academia. I then went on and finished my clinical training with a NIHR clinical lecturership, and then went on and got a senior lecturership at UCL and a consultant cardiology role at Barts Heart Centre, which was newly founded at that time in terms of the merger between the Heart Hospital and Barts to form the largest cardiovascular institute in Europe. And then through that, I've been doing academia ever since in Cardio-Oncology, which is the cardiovascular care of cancer patients, who many of whom will develop complications as a result of those cancer treatments, and in cardiovascular MRI. And all the way through my current work, I've been trying to integrate my academia and my clinical work. So I'm very much a clinical academic. And then through work with my mentor, James Moon, who again is somebody who is not willing to accept the status quo. He's always wanting to push boundaries. Through him, we did a big project during COVID, which I can talk about a little bit more, but which really made me realize that one's boundaries and one's horizons can be pushed, providing you get the right people on board and take a different view on teamwork, on delivery, on trying to change outcomes. And through that, we achieved a huge amount in terms of academic outputs and actually impact on patients. And then subsequently after that, we suddenly realized that the work that we were doing academically, should be thinking about trying to commercialize. And again, I can talk about that a bit later.
Awesome. So one thing I just want to pull out immediately is that you are definitely getting inspiration from people that are, you mentioned pushing boundaries, taking a different view, questioning what people take for granted when you mentioned Daryl Francis. So clearly that's held in sort of high regard for you, which has obviously led you into everything you're doing from a more innovative capacity. I think what's interesting for me though is people often hold academia as like the antithesis of innovation, and academia is difficult to commercialize. It's a different method of thinking, and it's looking at problems. It's not finding whereas actually how you've described academia is actually the search of new information and innovative things within academia. It's just an interesting frame, because I often find that certain people that have done academia that find their way into commercialization say things like, "Oh, I could never have stayed in academia; it just wasn't innovative enough." Whereas you have obviously moved to commercial, but you're talking about it in a different way. So I guess my question is can academia be innovative? Although is that an okay thing to even say? Is that real?
Well, I think academia is moving towards, but definitely trying to embrace innovation and commercialization more, both in terms of the funding bodies and in terms of the universities. They're beginning to recognize the importance of that. And obviously all the major universities will have teams that are involved with that, and funders are interested in that as well. But I think in order to actually deliver meaningful change to patients, then it is important to have that triangulation between academia, commercialization and clinical practice. And so I suppose all of the teams that I've tried to work with in recent years have reflected all three elements of that. And that's got to be key. We need certainly any med tech that's going through to patients has to have active clinicians involved in some way, even if it's only in an advisory way. But otherwise, the instruments, the tools that are developed are really not going to be clinically applicable. But also, perhaps more importantly, by having state-of-the-art tech available for academia, we're able to not only improve efficiency, but also start to redefine disease. And again, I can talk about that a bit more later. But there are things that we have discovered through having better measurement precision that have allowed us to better understand disease and to improve the delivery of clinical trials, both in terms of investigator-led, but also perhaps more importantly in terms of pharma-led clinical trials. And by better precision medicine to better identify suitable candidates for therapies, we should be able to get better results and be able to target treatments more specifically to the right patient. So really, we need that triangulation between the three in order to be able to change outcomes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I know that certain corners of health tech and digital health and healthcare innovation could certainly benefit from a more evidence-based approach, let's just say. So you're absolutely right. It's definitely all those things working in tandem. I think let's touch on some of these things you've mentioned, the project in COVID, the notion of, more innovation and better measurement in academia leading to increased knowledge and that kind of thing. Give us some examples of what's been going on for you in those two things.
So during COVID, very early on, we spoke to colleagues who were in Bergamo, which is one of the areas in Italy that was affected most early on in terms of COVID. And it was very clear that what was coming to us was greater than what we had anticipated, both professionally or as a government in terms of preparation for COVID. So at that stage, we realised that we needed to deliver some research early, and that all the focus in research was actually on the severe hospitalised patients. But obviously there was going to be a huge tsunami of patients with less severe COVID, but also we needed to understand a bit more about risk and understand a bit more about some of the less severe disease manifestations. So we decided to conduct a big piece of research, and the way that we were able to get that off the ground early was going out to philanthropic organisations to get donations. And so within 2 weeks of asking for funding, we got £1.6 million of funding from individuals, from hedge funds in the US, from many different organisations, because what we were doing was very simple, which was to create a biobank of samples from people collected serially through COVID. So actually we're one of the only biobanks that had samples of patients both before, during and after, where we knew for certain they hadn't been infected before, during and after COVID. So they are healthcare workers in our organisation, and we had over 700 people contributing data weekly with weekly blood samples and swabs. And then that gave us a biobank that was a unique resource for researchers around the world to be able to use. So we ended up with more than 150 researchers from 15 organisations using those samples for a whole range of different clinical questions, immunological questions, socioeconomic questions, psychometric questions, etc. And so we were able to understand a lot about early COVID and how COVID was transmitted and the immune response to it. And that really gave us an insight into the fact that you can achieve quite a lot, even if you're not an expert on the field. So none of us leading it initially were immunologists, but we ended up the samples being used by world-leading groups in immunology. We ended up with papers in Lancet, Science, Nature, and actually some of the results were actually presented by Fauci in the White House briefings on COVID. And that was not because we knew anything about it. It's because we created the resources and the right people to be able to deliver those results. Yeah. And it was that really kind of highlighted that if you've got the will, the way, and most importantly, the people to do that, then actually you can achieve a lot, much more than you would expect.
Yeah. Let me just touch on this a second. The will, the way, and the people. So I think, because we're talking about sort of intrapreneurship here to begin with, before we talk about your entrepreneurship journey. And this is fascinating to me because when you talked about this project initially, you talked about pushing boundaries and the willingness to take a different view, the willingness to just sort of have an idea and run with it. I think this might help. Let's go and set this thing up. I think there's a lot of that is the will. You definitely need, and it's okay to have the will to go and do something like that. I think a lot of clinicians that exist in the system can feel a bit oppressed by the system. They simply don't have the time, or, their clinical supervisor might not like that they're even doing that, or their TPD or training program director, or for those that don't know what it is, like they can have these narratives and it can be difficult to kind of innovate within the system. But I think actually that then comes to the way, finding the way that allows you to do that. And I think, obviously being senior helps there because you've got a lot more jurisdiction to do what you want. But the bit that then everyone can do and relate to, I imagine, as well, is the people, actually finding people around you that want to pull in the same direction and then trying to do things together. I think, thinking back to when I was doing kind of, well, what started as quality improvement projects and then turned into business cases, all the rest of it, you absolutely need all three of those things if you're going to make any sort of change in healthcare. I think as a clinician on the inside and trying to do that like entrepreneurship thing, and the bit that really sticks out of me that I just wanted to pull out is you cannot do these things alone. It's almost impossible to do these things alone. But I think it's really inspiring that you can tell that story of having an idea and seeing it through to the level of the White House reporting on stuff from just an idea that you had in your mind. Like that's awesome and amazing, and not for everyone. It's not one of those things that everyone has to do or should do. But I think if you're nourished by that as a clinician, I think it's so important that you do that stuff. I think what I'm interested in though is like, what gave you the confidence or the ability, or how did you know that you could do this or that would even be possible? And like, do you have any advice for clinicians that might feel frustrated with something in their working life, that perhaps want to make a change, have an idea? Like, what would be your advice to them to actually see something through? Maybe not to the level of it being reported in the White House, but at least to making a change in their world.
I mean, I think firstly, you've got to have something that you feel strongly about that you want to change, and you identified that very clearly. I think there's got to be something where you see there's a gap, where you see that the current situation is wrong, be it there being lack of data, lack of evidence, and you've got to have the people that are willing to work with you. Now, that's where I've been so lucky all the way through, is I've had people who provide me with confidence and accompany me. So James Moon, who is the CEO of MyCardium, who is my mentor, has got an incorrigible energy to be able to just take an idea and run with it, and almost bash away the barriers as he goes through, in terms of not taking no for an answer and being willing to keep exploring ways through the challenges that are inevitable. I think the key is that we set up MyCardium with a group of people who were like-minded. We'd known each other for a long time. I've worked with James for 20 years or so. I've worked with Mark Westwood, one of the other founders, for 15 years. Anthony Shimmin, who works with us, who has a background very different to ours in commercial. He has been working with the team for over 10 years in an academic capacity. And we've all known each other for a long time and have built up a high level of trust, essentially. But the key is that the people that we've got in to doing the health tech are also, and this is extremely unusual, they're actually clinicians who are the coders of the tech as well.
Interesting.
So this is where we've been particularly lucky, because it means that what they are building is, their vision is essentially the same as our vision, because they want to use tools that are going to be immediately applicable to patients and are going to be attractive and usable to clinicians. They have that end product in their kind of end vision, and that they know how to get there. And so what we've been doing is creating a platform, creating the infrastructure to allow them to get there. So there's essentially the coders that are working on the MRI product. Rodri Davies, he initially started as a computer scientist who did a PhD back in the 90s in AI and brain imaging. He then decided he wanted to be a clinician, trained as a cardiologist, became a cardiology consultant. It's a very unusual journey.
Wow. So
he had these extraordinary skills and came and did research with us and built an AI tool for cardiac imaging that had 40% better precision than humans, and was obviously able to analyze scans almost instantaneously within seconds. So massively improving the efficiency of our scanning, both clinically and obviously academically. And then by building this tool, we were starting to be approached by pharma companies to be able to use this tool because of the improved precision in their phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. They obviously, pharma want to get a reliable result from their clinical trials. And they want to be able to reduce the sample size as much as possible. And by having that improved precision, it allowed them to be able to do that. And so I suppose, again, seeing the use of the product through pharma then gave us the confidence to think, actually, we should be commercializing this. And that's how we started on the MRI product, 1CMR. And that's where we are at the moment, going through regulatory and moving into early sales the end of this calendar year, 2024. In terms of our Echo software, my journey took a full circle, essentially, where I was aware that Darryl Francis and Matt Shin, who again is an amazing cardiologist who has coding skills beyond anybody, essentially, were developing AI for Echo software, really following a parallel pathway to what we were doing with MRI. And so at the beginning of this calendar year, we decided to work with them to commercialize their product. So again, they've developed something that's useful for them as clinicians that they were using in their clinical research and which they could see would have immediate benefit to patients. So their vision at the end was exactly the same as what our vision was for the 1CMR software. And so they are now working with us, and Echo Confidence, the echocardiography or cardiac ultrasound software, is now being developed through MyCardium as well. But so we had clinicians who were building the software alongside the commercial team, the regulatory team, us, etc. So we were creating a platform which would allow them to do what they would do. We've obviously now expanded the teams, and we've now got engineers and computer scientists working on this as well. But we started with a common vision. I think that's the key point.
It's incredible. Vision, really interesting word. I think the clinicians as coders, clinicians as computer scientists, clinicians as engineers, this is a trend now that is absolutely amazing for the health tech space, because exactly as you've described, those people don't just see problems, they see the solution they need to build and can build it. They can literally go on ward rounds and visualize things that can be, imagined into the real world, that then go and solve the problems that they're experiencing. I think it's an absolutely wonderful trend in health tech and long may it continue, by the way.
I think we do need to be cognizant of the fact that they start the journey, but it needs to also be partnered by computer scientists and engineers. For any commercial company, we're never going to be able to be sustainable only with clinicians. And so we've had to build into our journey over the last 12 months, making sure that our teams are resilient and future-proof, and that we've got enough capacity and breadth to be able to deliver a product that ultimately will be robust in the market.
Yeah, and it's another very, very good point. I remember speaking to someone on this podcast a while ago that they were talking about there's a big difference between doing a computer science degree, perhaps working for 6 months somewhere, and then training in medicine, or vice versa. That it's very different when you've had a full career in one of those things. You are performing at a very, very different level. So whilst a clinician that's got a degree might be able to visualize something or know to some extent what they can ask for, to expect the same level of delivery in both domains is quite a challenge if they haven't had the same career time in both domains. So I can completely appreciate that as a concept. So the product, what it is you're building, have built, are continuing to build and iterate across those different things. Can you walk through that product for me as if I'm a clinician, as if I'm a clinician that's using it in its format in diagnostics, etc. So yeah, walk it through for me as like a user. What will I see? What will I experience? How's that better from my experience without this?
So we have two products, a product for cardiac MRI analysis and one for echocardiography or cardiac ultrasound. The Echo product, Echo Confidence, is designed primarily to improve measurement precision, but also to improve efficiency. So the current status quo is that a clinical scientist or physiologist who is a highly skilled professional will acquire the images in a patient when they come for a cardiac ultrasound or echocardiogram. The slot that's booked will be 45 minutes, and the acquisition of the images will take about 20 minutes, and the person taking the scan will make the measurements on the ultrasound machine. They then will finish the scan. They'll then make some additional measurements up to about 150 in all, and type a manual report, and then the report will generally be checked by a cardiologist. All of this is fairly labour intensive, and certainly in the UK we've got very long waiting lists, and we've got capacity issues with patients needing these scans. Bear in mind, most patients coming through a cardiology clinic and many patients who are seen by a GP will need an echocardiogram. So in the US, about 10% of Medicare patients each year will have an echocardiogram. So it's a huge proportion.
It's huge, yeah.
We obviously can't really increase the number of staff who are highly skilled to do these scans. So we need to try and improve the efficiency. And Echo Confidence essentially can do that by meaning that no measurements need to be made on the machine itself. So the time that the machine is being used per patient will be shorter. But more importantly, when the person sits down to the reporting station to do the scan, all of the measurements will already have been made. And actually there will be suggested auto text generated for what the report should say in terms of whether things are normal or not. So the AI obviously can tell whether values come within the normal range for the age, sex, body surface area, etc., and so can generate whether text is whether results are within the normal range or not. And people could choose whether they want to have those suggestions switched on or not. The other thing that's key is that when we acquire an ultrasound scan, we generally require several heartbeats worth of data. We may even acquire some repeat acquisitions of different views, but we generally don't make measurements all of those views. We'll just make one measurement per view. Whereas using AI, you can make measurements on all of the beats. You can average it. So we present our data with means and confidence intervals. So that also allows you to understand how likely or how representative those values are for that patient in terms of reproducibility, in terms of quality control. And we can also tell instantaneously whether scans are complete or not because of AI generated view recognition software within the algorithm. So what we hope to do is to be able to seriously change or revolutionize the efficiency of echo departments and also improve confidence in results. And I think that's really critical.
It is critical. And if I can jump in, I think this is awesome. And it's incredible to me because I remember, my wife's pregnant, my wife and co-founder Jessica is pregnant currently. And we've obviously gone in for ultrasounds, and quite literally someone is, and to put this into I guess a visual format for people that might not know how an echo is conducted or anything like that, or an ultrasound full stop, you've got someone that's got an ultrasound probe in one hand that is trying to find an image which pops up on screen, and then with the other hand they're sort of rolling this roller ball on a keyboard attached to the screen and clicking, trying to, like, they're rolling a cursor across what would be the heart in this case, and they're clicking, and then they're rolling the ball to the other side of the heart and clicking again, and then a line comes up with a number, and then they're logging that number all with the other hand. And you just think, like, and you're quite right to say highly skilled, ultrasonographer or whoever it is that's highly skilled in whatever country and whatever they're called doing that. What's the part of that that's top of their license? What's the part of that they get job satisfaction from? What's the part of that frustrates them on the other side of the coin? It's pretty clear to see which are the parts that require the skill and which are the parts that don't. So the notion that is automatically measured and concluded is great. And I think and clear and obvious where the efficiency gains are. And it's almost like, it's one of those ideas where you think, why hasn't this been done already? This is just clearly one of those obvious things. But the other thing that you quite rightly point out is the experience of the clinician and that person, and just how they would feel with all of these things taken care of, not only from the efficiency of not needing to do the clicks, but actually as well, quite rightly, the confidence that they can get that it's an average of all those things, or that extra measurements have been taken that they didn't need and those have been factored in. And so just the quality of the decision has then gone up, so that doesn't need to weigh on the mind later, or they can be more proud of that result, or know that patient is going to go on to have more accurate treatment or better, whatever it is. So Yeah, I think for so many reasons, this is what might be described as quite a simple intervention. There's a lot of complexity that goes behind simplicity, I can appreciate from a computer science perspective at the very least. But the fact that it is such a simple thing in the sense of removing the admin component, leaving in the part that's top of their license, and all the benefits that has for the individual clinician, the patient, the efficiency of the whole system and department, sounds wonderful.
But I think it's the frustrations that we've had with clinicians about the current systems that have led us to do this. So just as a clinical example, I lead the Cardio-Oncology service at Barts, and so many of my patients are having to have serial scans during their cancer treatment to make sure there's been no effect on their hearts. Each time, using current software, each time you have a scan and you want to compare it to the last one, you have to close that scan. You have to then open the old scan, look at how the person's made the measurements, whether you would agree with the measurements or not, and then have a look at it and write the report. So often when I'm sitting in clinic, it will take me, several minutes to open the echo software, look at one scan, go back, look at the last scan. And often they would have had 12 scans. For patients who with metastatic breast cancer, for example, they may have had 12 up to 20 scans over the years, and you're trying to look at that comparison. And you also know there will be variability between the different people that have made those scans. Echo Confidence has a way of being able to batch open old scans, and then the results are presented on a graph with each of the images as thumbnails. Those can just be copy and pasted into letters or notes. So clinicians can look at that and they can just see the trends, they can see the changes with time. But also, most importantly, they know that the measurements that have been made in the same way because they've been made by the AI and rather than by individual human operators. And we know, obviously, from our technical validation data that our reproducibility is better than different human operators. So it really does give that confidence, hence the name Echo Confidence.
Yeah. That's awesome. It's just so wonderfully practical. I'm sort of smiling as well because I know for a fact there's even clinicians that I know that if they are listening to this will just be wildly Googling you currently, being like, how do we get this immediately? Like this is definitely what we need, because I just know the frustration of particularly like just my close friends, right? And the generation that we're in, the generation of like, we can just Google the answer. I can just WhatsApp my colleague. I don't need to like go through any like all of this. We're a generation of like finding those shortcuts. We know enough about technology. We're enough technology natives to find those shortcuts of just feeling so satisfied when we just get something that solves the problem. So the bit that's really getting me is closing it each time and opening it again, looking at the measurement, closing it again, opening it again, doing that 12 times over a scan to get a single image, like to get a trend is just ludicrous. But to single click that then into the letter and all the rest of it, like it's just, this is so practical.
I mean, the other thing that we've seen certainly with the MRI software is the ability to be able to kind of change disease definitions. So our CMR software has improved measurement precision, but also allows us to be able to make measurements anywhere in the heart at any point within the cardiac cycle. And just taking this example, the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is a heart muscle disorder, which is actually incredibly common in globally, has a fixed universal definition of 15 millimeters wall thickness or heart wall thickness as being the diagnosis of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. But actually, that doesn't make any sense when you think about it. That's based on data from the 1970s, and it makes no sense. If you're a 75-year-old small Asian female as compared to a 25-year-old rugby-playing male, then by definition your heart is going to be bigger. And so having those universal definitions is wrong. But the reason that it exists is because we've never really had the techniques to be able to do it better. But using AI, you're able to look at the wall thickness in every segment. You're able to correct it for age, sex, ethnicity, body surface area, etc., and to be able to create personalized definitions for disease that really should redefine disease and actually, perhaps more importantly, redefine who should be having some of the newer therapies that are out there to treat heart muscle disease. And there's those kind of changes which go beyond just efficiency savings and actually have the ability to really transform disease, transform treatments, and transform outcomes of patients.
Yeah, I guess because you not only do you make the whole system more efficient by genuinely defining the upper and lower limits of people a lot more effectively, but actually once you've then grouped those populations and you have the data, you can then start to infer new trends, I guess, and identify new physiological processes per demographic and that kind of thing. So not only do you even out care and make it more efficient, you then are able to become even more precise, and actually the learning of what we might discover in the future becomes far more personalized per demographic. And
totally. And we know, for example, that there are a lot of new therapies available, both in terms of drug therapies and gene therapies available for heart muscle disorders. But everybody, clinicians, society, but most importantly, pharma, want those drugs to go to the right patients. They don't want to be giving inappropriate therapies to patients who don't actually have those disorders. And similarly, they don't want to deprive potentially eligible patients from some of these newer treatments just because the disease definitions are incorrect. So we would expect that AI will actually be able to change outcomes of clinical trials by ensuring that the correct patients are recruited in the first place and that drug therapies are actually targeted to the correct patients.
Incredible. Where does this fit from a defensibility perspective as a company? Like, what part of this do you own? Like, how defensible is it for you?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the code that's already is actually already open access in the public domain, but all of the training and all the user interface design and many of the algorithms that resulted from it are we have IP for, and we've gone through trade secrets to ensure that we have everything documented robustly.
Before we start wrapping up, I just want to ask you about how you manage all of this stuff in your time. Obviously, multitasking currently, nipping out to do pacemakers is one thing, but starting a company and obviously running a company is very difficult. And one thing that I noticed is that you might be the founder of MyCardium, but you're not the CEO. So that's interesting that, as you mentioned, I think James, one of your mentors, you said has become CEO. So as a clinician, that seems like a really interesting move, because obviously the clinical leadership is still what you can give and do. Everything that you know on that clinical medicine side, your contacts, your network, like all of that stuff is still obviously relevant, and the role that you can play is very different as founder versus CEO. And obviously, never being a CEO, like it would not arguably make sense for you to run a company that's got such ambitions where you've got so much other things on your plate. So I'm just interested in that decision really as a means of maybe balancing your own life, or not needing to then sacrifice the clinical world and your commitments there maybe, or just talk to me about being a founder and not the CEO and what that means for everything else you've got going on.
So we actually co-founded it. There were 4 co-founders, so I was not the sole co-founder. Okay. And I think we're all generally playing to our own strengths. We recognise where our strengths are, and we recognise where we really add value to the business. James's value, which is multiple, is really the strategic vision and the ability to be able to really recognize where we need to go ahead of the time that we're trying to make those decisions. So he's always recognized when it is that we're likely to need investment, where we should be looking, who our partners should be. He's good at really understanding the broader picture and bringing in external advisors or changing the staff structure as we move along. I mean, currently we've got 26 full-time employees, and we've got about another 40 contractors. So we're big already.
Wow, yeah.
But it's about trying to make sure that every individual person that's brought in as an employee has got a very clear role beforehand. We know exactly what it is that person is going to do, how they're going to add benefit, how they're going to influence and bring in revenue to the company, and really improve the product that we have at the end of it, and make make us as a company stronger. And the teamwork of the staff that we brought in has been absolutely critical all the way through. And actually for the Echo Confidence, the parts of the business that I'm really responsible for, many of the staff members are engineers or staff project managers who we've worked with for many, many years in either the NHS or academia, but who we recognise and plucked out as being people that we thought could be real leaders in this space. And so certainly through many aspects of the business, and the other aspects of the business we haven't even talked about here, which is our core lab business, where we provide imaging core lab facilities for industry pharma-led studies, which is actually is what's been bootstrapping the software development, and has enabled us really to be a very flexible, agile organisation in terms of development, because we've had the funding that's been coming in through a regular funding stream through that, has enabled us to be able to move much faster without the debt, without the external investors, without the challenges that many other software businesses would have faced.
That is fascinating. So that as well for me speaks to, I was going to say the maturity. I don't think that's the right word, but I think a lot of health tech companies and digital health companies have got kind of like an ideal or an ideology of why they're founding it, which is very noble, and they want to save the NHS, and they want to make the NHS pay less for this service, and they want to help patients and all these different things, which is obviously great and for all the obvious reasons. I think though, to develop multiple business models that you can execute at the same time that are complementary in different areas to provide you with the revenue to make that equity more valuable when you do your investment round, or to, as you say, bootstrap the product and be able to work on it and pay some engineers and do those things. I think that's a really, really fascinating concept, especially at a time where it's difficult to raise money. It's difficult to raise money without traction, and to prove that you can sell as a team and as a company and all those things. I think it's a really, really interesting thing that you just dropped in there.
Pretty much all of the investments that we've got, apart from Innovate Grant, and we are an Innovate Scale-Up company. So we're one of the few UK companies that have been adopted by a government scheme called Innovate UK, basically, where they have an Innovate Scale-Up team where they partner with you to help you develop. And most of the funding has either come a small part from that, but also largely from people who actually will be potential customers. So colleagues who are cardiologists, not just in the UK, but globally, have invested money because they see this as a product. They see this as something that they would buy, that they would use, and that they would kind of advocate to other people to use. And they have confidence in us as a team because they've known us for many years. We're on the board of multiple different imaging global organizations. So it means that we have connections, but also we have really a deep understanding of what is needed by the field. But then the other part of the funding has come through revenue from the core lab, whereby we've been able to essentially fund our own development, and that's been really exciting. But it's also, again, highlighted the confidence that another part of the field, i.e. industry and pharma, have in the product that we have, because they're using it for their clinical trials. And really there cannot be much higher endorsement for confidence in a technique than actually industry using it for their, they care about the results of their clinical trials. They want them to be done properly. And so that's a really good endorsement for our products as well.
It's incredible. It's an amazing story. I think to support 26 PAYE full-time hires as well. Like that's not a small amount of revenue that might show product market fit. That's a decent chunk of money. That plus an Innovate grant and all the rest of it. I mean, that is really interesting. So you must be at a point though now where you must consider that an injection of capital at this point, looking to land in the US, looking to scale rapidly now, regulatory on the horizon. This is a really compelling story for investors because they're not paying to see you through regulatory for a start. They're not paying to take a risk on you to get first customers. They're not paying you to develop the product. They're not paying you to do any of those things that seed investors need to worry about. Or, I mean, dare I say, even like the Valley of Death Series A stuff, like you're sort of beyond that even with
well,
like,
yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, we've got the next generation development to do. I mean,
yeah.
you know, we are moving towards disease specific diagnostics. So, you know, we've talked about heart muscle disease already. There are now specific tools that we are building, which will be able to tell with good reliability whether a heart reflects a specific disease condition. And that's going to be a big value, not just in terms of being able to highlight to the clinician what the diagnosis is, but really then feed into a treatment pathway to ensure that patients get treatments. And I think certainly overseas in the US, these kind of disease diagnostic algorithms are particularly important, and that's the next generation that we're working on in terms of models. But as you say, kind of getting global market traction, even with partners, is going to require some additional investment, and that's where we're looking for some investment early 2025. Well, early to mid 2025.
Makes sense. Pretty compelling, if I do say so. I don't feel like you'll struggle once you get in the room with them, with the story that you can tell. But I think the traction really speaks for itself. I think it really like the vibe that I get from this is that actually, to go full circle to what we talked about initially, it feels like innovation, but with a kind of robust academic evidence-based heart to it, if that makes sense. I mean, I've used heart probably subliminally there, but like you've planted that in me, like a pacemaker. No, it does feel like that to me. It feels like, whilst I talk to a lot of health tech companies, right? I think a lot of health tech companies want to tell a story and they want to build excitement through potential, and that's how they attract investment because they're selling they're on the way up. It feels to me almost that you're selling a story here, particularly to your investors on. It's a very sort of like retrospective story of like, look what we've already done, look how far we've come, and actually this is the evidence we're based on. This is the way that we do things. We have all of this in place, and I mean, the plot twist, you can now go and sell the upside as well, and you can tell that story, but it's on such a robust base, and I think that's testament probably to your academic background, the places that you're involved in, because you can't go and speculate, and you can't build a speculative startup really because of everything that you're involved in. It would ruin your credibility in other places. So of course what you need to do has to stand on its own feet. It has to be robust. It has to be regulatory approved. It has to be all these things that you just will naturally do. And I think as clinicians as well, like, I mean, not certainly not all, but because we're evidence-based creatures, I do think we generally as a group of people find it quite hard to start companies or innovate or start tech companies without this level of evidence, because that's just where our mind goes. We just automatically assume the world requires that evidence, again, like it often doesn't in quite a lot of industries and a lot of all the rest of it. We certainly do a bit more in healthcare, but even then, I think clinicians can struggle a little bit. But we don't, as clinicians, often have the network and the connections and the ability to kind of see it into the real world, which you absolutely have with the incredible team that you've put in place. And again, whilst you did attribute a lot of that to luck, I think, you know, we create our own luck, and you know, being excellent and being elected to roles where you're surrounded by other excellent people certainly isn't luck. And I think you've definitely taken your opportunities where you've had them there to build that team and to keep those people around, and all those things requires far more than luck. So I think you've done an awesome job. It's been a pleasure having you on. I mean, the last question that I want to ask you is actually maybe from like a cardiology perspective rather than a company perspective, because I sort of know the answer from a company perspective, but from a cardiology perspective and the evidence and the research and that you're involved in at the minute, like what's exciting at the minute? Like what are like the interesting academic studies or things going on or areas. I know, as I said to you before we started recording, like my brother was obsessed about the right ventricle, like super interested in like hypercardic cardiomyopathy in athletes that, you know, were having these massive cardiac events on the sports field and things like that. That's what really excited him, and solving those problems. But yeah, for you, like what's exciting for you in the cardiology field right now?
Well, for me, I think, I mean, with my cardio-oncology hat on, I can see where cancer has really transformed over the last 25 years, from being a disease where you'd be diagnosed with lung cancer to now where you would be diagnosed with a disease not just based on histology or the type of tissue, but actually the markers on it, and then the genetics and your therapy that you would be given for that would be based on that, and that has transformed outcomes. We are currently at a stage where we have ability to apply that kind of precision medicine technique to cardiology. And that will not just be about better phenotyping, so better imaging of the heart, to look at structure and function in more detail, and to be able to break down those broader definitions into much more concrete, discrete definitions and discrete categories of patients. But also, ideally, we need to move it towards actually being a molecular disease as well, whereby we have proteomic panels that are able to diagnose particular cardiomyopathies or understand which patients are most likely to benefit from particular therapies, or alternatively, whose risk is going to be higher and perhaps we need to monitor more closely. We need to take a better, more refined approach to managing our cardiology patients. And we're at the kind of cusp of being able to do that. We've still got more work to do, but it's exciting. And I think we can learn a lot from the way that cancer have transformed over the last 25 years or so. And hopefully we'll be able to deliver that.
Beautiful. Thoroughly enjoyed it, Charlotte. Thank you so much for coming on. For those people that want to learn more, investors or otherwise, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you and or the rest of the people at the company?
So our website, MyCardiumAI.com, is probably the best place to start. Otherwise, you'll be able to find my details online. Feel free to reach out. Feedback or any interest or advice would be very gratefully received. So thank you.
You might get a few emails after saying that. Cool. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for having me.